Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Glassman. I'm a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and one of 12 fellows who comprise AEI's Center for Internet Communications and Technology Policy, founded just a year and a half ago and going very strong under our leader, Jeff Eisenach. We focus on internet and telecom policy, privacy, cybersecurity, intellectual property, and antitrust issues. And please check out our blog, techpolicydaily.com. Back in September, the Tech Policy Center launched an interview series called The Disruptors with Peter Thiel. Since then, we've had similar sessions with Jeff Pulver and Walter Isaacson, and now we are pleased to have one with Eric Schmidt, who will be interviewed by Arthur Brooks. Arthur just completed his 5th year as president of AEI. Eric Schmidt knows Washington. He grew up just across the river. He graduated from Yorktown High School, where just last year he was inducted into the Hall of Fame and Inspiration, joining Katie Couric and the late astronaut David Brown. Eric went to Princeton, got his PhD in computer science at Berkeley, worked at the celebrated Xerox PARC Research Center and Bell Laboratories, then as Chief Technology Officer at Sun Microsystems and CEO of Novell before joining Google as CEO in 2001. In 2011, he became Executive Chairman of Google. He's also a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He's the co-author of The New Digital Age with my very good friend and former colleague Jared Cohen, and more recently of How Google Works with Jonathan Rosenberg. How Google Works is full of important insights for those of us here in Washington. It has the freshness, the optimism, and the contrarian spirit of Silicon Valley, which those of us here in a city often mired in cynicism, angst, and risk aversion could use a lot more of. And of course, that is the purpose of this series, to bring more of Silicon Valley to Washington at a time when there's a risk of too much Washington infecting Silicon Valley. Before we begin, I should note that a couple of upcoming Tech Policy Center events on April 1st, FTC Commissioner Maureen Allhausen on regulatory humility, a timely topic, some would think, and on April 16th, a Disruptors interview with Catherine Bradley, president of CityBridge Foundation, on technology in education. Arthur?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you to all of you, and please join me in welcoming Eric Schmidt.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim, and thanks, Arthur, for doing this.
Thanks. It's a delight to have you back in your old neighborhood. For those of you who did not know, and I guess you didn't hear it in the introduction, so you should hear it here, Eric's father was an economist who at one point was an AEI adjunct economist and actually published a short book with the AEI Press. We looked at it again. We pulled it out of the archives about a year ago, and it's great work.
Thank you.
It's as fresh today as when your father wrote it.
He's still right.
He's still right. Still right. That's terrific. And we appreciate you taking a little time with us here. I'm going to structure this with some of my own questions and leave about half the time for our audience. And I want to start just by giving you the most general question I can think of, which is that, well, you've been at the helm of Google for about 10 years now. What's the biggest lesson you've learned at the helm of arguably the smartest company in the world?
Well, first, thank you. And I love the AEI because you guys ask the hardest questions. And you
it hasn't gotten hard yet.
not of me, but of the world. And you have a long, long history of doing this in an awfully interesting way. What has constantly surprised me is the power of platforms and combinatoric growth. If you were to tell me that Android was on its way at some point in the next few years to be 2 billion users, that Gmail and Chrome were on the ways to similar numbers like about 1 billion, if you were to tell me that Internet Explorer is about to be renamed because it's such a failed product, sorry.
Hey, it's news. We just made news.
No. This was you will remember in D.C. in 1997 the issues about that, right? Put it into context: 1997, Internet Explorer, Microsoft trial, and so forth. So the fact of the matter is, innovation occurs, and when it occurs at scale, it's enormously impressive. And I'm constantly underestimating the impact that scaled platforms can have to make the world a better place. The world is very big, it's very complicated, people are very, very smart, right? This stuff really works.
Now, that may or may not be the biggest mistake you've made over the past 10 years. You make an amazing amount of decisions. You're just going through one decision after another. You're trying new things. Was that the biggest mistake, or tell me about a bigger mistake you made?
I'm assuming, no, I think for me personally as CEO, the biggest mistake I made was probably not understanding the scale of the social revolution. And if you had looked today, most young people are using things like Snapchat and Instagram and so forth. That idea was quite foreign even 5 years ago, to the point where the founders of Instagram left Google to do it. Right? I mean, literally it was in our grasp, and of course it went off to doing a phenomenal job. So I think that one of the problems you have in a corporation is you get sort of a programming. You know, you think of yourself as a platform company with a particular kind of user model, but in fact tech is precisely dynamic because these models change, right? I grew up in the mainframe industry, then I grew up in the PC, Microsoft, Intel industry, then I grew up in the web programming industry, and now I'm growing up in the mobile industry. And we don't know what's happening next, but we know there'll be something after mobile.
So seeing around the corner is always a tricky thing.
It's very, very difficult to disrupt yourself at any level, right? It's true of any organization, it's true in Washington, it's true not in Washington. But what also happens is you get very comfortable with business models, and a new business model comes along and people just dismiss it, right? And the story of tech is an established player that is disrupted by something which they think of as a toy. When I was a graduate student, we worked on an operating system called Unix, which is the predecessor to Linux, which is the predecessor to everything that you guys are using. And I remember my friends saying, yeah, we think of it as a toy. It doesn't really do very much, which I viewed as offensive, you know, because I was doing everything on Unix, and we won. Right? So that energy, that youthful energy of making these new things is what drives the innovation cycle so profoundly in our industry. There's no analog to my knowledge anywhere else in any other industries, because there's no other industry that has as least amount of regulation, has as large amount of scale, and as good a sort of cost performance with respect to capital as the software industry, which is why software, as has been said, is largely taking over most industries.
Now, one industry for sure where this doesn't apply is government, and you're in the company town for government, especially big government. So I want to ask you about your own attitude as reflected in your job choices. In 2012, there was a report that suggested that you were offered a cabinet position by President Obama, and here was your response. I don't want to be a federal government employee. I endorse that, by the way. Google is my home, which I think is a great thing to say too. Now, imagine for a moment that you had come back to your original home, DC, and you had taken a cabinet position. What, in your view, is the biggest policy change that we need to see here today?
Well, there's such a long list.
You can give me two or three if you want. That's okay too.
What I've said publicly many times is that in the long list of stupid policies of the U.S. government, I think our attitude toward immigration has got to be near the top. And the reason is that we have the best university. By the way, it's important to establish some facts here. Somewhere between 18 or 19 of the top 20 universities in the world are in the United States. We take very, very smart people, bring them to the country, give them a diploma, and kick them out where they go and they create companies that compete with us. Brilliant strategy. I mean, I can go on, but I won't waste the audience's time. The fact of the matter is the immigration policy alone would materially improve the economic output of the United States, because immigrants on balance start more companies and so forth. And I'm on a sort of entrepreneur kick. I've been trying to figure out if you could wave a magic wand, what would you wave? And for politicians, it turns out if you could just create a lot more jobs, most problems are solved, because more jobs means more revenue, which means more taxes, which means more spending, which is always good for special interests. More jobs also means people have a greater sense of identity, they have a greater sense of self-worth, they have income, higher standards of living, and so forth and so on. The best way to create new jobs is to create more entrepreneurs. How? Or why? Because people have studied this. 70% of the net new jobs in the last decade in America were created by fast-growing, small, now much larger companies, the so-called gazelles. It's not large companies and it's not small companies. It's small companies that are growing quickly, whether they're venture funded or not. That's the math, right? Mm-hmm. So we just need to create more people in every industry. And so tech is obvious. The explosion that we're going to see in biology and synthetic biology and in genetics and so forth will create a huge number of jobs. Again, so forth and so on. Look at fracking. Fracking alone has created a very, very large revolution in jobs in America to much economic benefit.
Now, you talk, and I've heard you talk at length about H-1B1 visa reform because we do want to reform our immigration system. And AEI has a study that shows that high-skill immigrants, on average, create 5 jobs. Each one creates 5 jobs, and so it's a smart economic policy.
And in the logic of Washington, if I can just sort of decry the logic here, everyone actually agrees that there should be more H-1B visas in order to create more tech, more science, more analytical jobs. This is known as the stapling your green card to your diploma strategy. Everyone agrees in both parties.
We could just confiscate their passports. That would be easier too.
We do that for other reasons.
Yeah.
The effect of this, however, is you can never get a political solution because that's seen as a good thing, and all of the other political issues involving immigration are difficult. So all I'm asking is separate out this specific thing, which will materially improve economic growth. It's good for many, many industries, not just our own. It's good for politicians. It's more revenue, more jobs, and so forth and so on. And deal with the other immigration issues, which are very serious and very important, separately. For 20 years, we've tried to make that argument, and for 20 years, we've lost. And in the privacy of private meetings, leaders on both sides of the aisle will admit that that's what's really going on.
Now, having heard you talk about immigration reform, I know that your views extend beyond the economic benefits of immigration reform. In point of fact, the happiest life comes from a life that's built by oneself. The concept of earned success is central to what we think about at AEI, and I know that you agree with that strongly. So can I push you beyond this element and talk about not just the economic benefits, but the non-economic benefits, and not just high-skill immigration, but low-skill immigration as well? How would you think about this comprehensively as a leader? I know you're not soaking up a lot of low-skill immigrants in your industry, but I know you've thought about it.
Let's go back to, you've written a lot about happiness
Yeah.
and your thoughts on that. And I think that when I think about happiness, I think about meaning, right? And you want, when you get to my age anyway, life is about meaning and seriousness of purpose and those kinds of things. And life is not necessarily always happy. It's tough to raise a family, it's tough to run a company, it's tough to run an institute like you do, but it provides enormous satisfaction compounded over your life, right? So that should be your life mission, is to have a life of meaning, right? So with that as your umbrella statement, which I think you do agree with, when you think about humans, right, you want to give people opportunities for meaning, right? So I'm one of these people who believes that we're better off having more immigration rather than less. It's the nature of our country. And I'll give you a thought experiment. If you look at Europe, Europe is aging quite rapidly, and there's estimates that the reproduction rate, that is because of the dependency ratios and so forth, are declining so quickly that, for example, Japan will go from 120 million people to 80 million people. Now, as a business person, you think, well, what's that like? That's a third of your revenue lost because the customers don't exist, right? Your revenue just went down a third. By the way, most stock markets assume modest growth, right? So how are you going to, over a couple of decades, deal with the fact that 1/3 of your customers are going to go away? Well, one is produce more customers through immigration or greater reproductive performance. But
Greater reproductive performance. That's right. Eric Schmidt is in favor of greater reproductive performance.
More children. But an alternative is to.
See, you're a Catholic like me.
That's right. Alternatively, right, you can basically export. Mm-hmm. But all of these solutions involve a more global world, a more integrated world, and in my view, more immigration.
In point of fact, the idea of creating more customers is something that most societies are trying to deal with, at least developed societies are trying to deal with. And there are some dystopian futures that we're looking at, and we have even colleagues here at AEI that wonder what it will mean when we have a high skill and a low skill economy, such that notwithstanding the fact that the number of consumers is decreasing, we believe that just a few people can maintain as much GDP per capita as before, but people will be less occupied at the lower end of the skill spectrum. What does the future look like to you?
So I have a lot of trouble with the dystopian views because I think history goes against that. It's fine to write science fiction about that and so forth, but if you look at over the last few hundred years, using any metric, I'll start with dentistry, by the way, things are much, much better. And they're likely to get a lot better because not just this generation is smarter than the previous ones, but our children's generation and their children's generation will be smarter than we are. And I'm sorry to say, but it's just true, right? It's true in every metric. So get over it, right? The kids are smarter than the parents. It's how it's always been. And thank goodness we're educating them and all the right things and give them the keys as soon as we can. So what happens is that everybody gets into this state where they assume that the world is static, right? That whatever we're currently doing as it gets replaced, there won't be a replacement. Now, if you look at what was Washington, D.C. and America like 100 years ago? I don't know, 40% of the people, 50% of the people worked on farms, 11% were illiterate in America. There were huge problems with things like malaria and other diseases in the South, right? Still, think about the segregation issues, which are horrific, and the treatment of women and all those sorts of things, right? You wouldn't want to go back 100 years. Think about the change in 100 years over that period, and then imagine what it'll be like 100 years from now. So absolutely, right, manufacturing jobs are declining as a percentage of employment, and service jobs are increasing. That's been true for 20 to 30 years, right? We should expect it to continue. The trend lines are fairly serious. So it's absolutely true that modern technology, artificial intelligence, and so forth will in fact produce more efficiency. But economic theory, which again AEI spends a lot of time talking about, also means that capitalism works. And this is a capitalistic country. Other countries have different problems. But in our case, this next generation will find jobs. They'll find jobs doing it. There's a lot of evidence that people who work with computers have higher wages than people who don't. There's furthermore a fair amount of evidence that jobs that are essentially not being replaced by computers, that people are in fact becoming smarter because of computers. There are people who will say, well, you know, the computers are going to be so smart, they're going to do all the work, and everyone will be lounging around. Okay, in that unlikely scenario, we'll have to have a meaning conversation, right? Now, the way this was resolved, I think the average work week was 70 to 72 hours a week in 1900. The average work week in America of roughly 40 now was established through a series of social conventions. In that scenario, you could imagine the work week might get shorter, although it's hard to imagine, but it might. Society will adapt.
Because we always have.
We always have, and we always will. And the people who are the unborn are smarter than the born in that sense.
Are you worried that we're going to see a growing income gap? However, you and I had supper a year or so ago, and this was the main topic of our conversation, I remember. Will we see growing income inequality as a result of the fact that the post-industrial revolution, the computing revolution, has effectively added cognitive ability to those who were best prepared and has left more and more people who are less prepared behind? Won't that exacerbate these trends?
If you look at it on a sort of Gini coefficient basis or an incomes basis, there's no question there's been an increase in inequality on a relative basis. And a lot of that is correlative to the distinction between people going to college and not going to college, and then the increasingly large returns to knowledge workers. And you see this in the new generation of wealth, the new Gilded Age, all that kind of stuff. And the tech industry is full of examples of this. And to me, that's a public policy question. I think what we want to do is we want to let capitalism, do its thing. But progressive taxation was invented precisely because of a variant of this, again, in the 1920s and 30s. Mm-hmm. Right? So people will sort this out. My own view, which is I think at odds with most people, is I would actually prefer to have, and this is impossible in our political system, to have a situation where we recognize that the wealth created today should be used to create an annuity for unborn children who might not be the beneficiaries of it in the future. So think of it as a tax strategy where some of this sort of new wealth that's being created, it would be wonderful if some of that new wealth could actually be put in trust for children who won't be able to take advantage of it or in some interesting way will be disadvantaged by it. And people are beginning to think about this idea rather than the current domestic spending model where everything's immediately spent.
You travel around the world all the time. Part of it is because Google has business all over the world, but part of it is because you consider yourself a warrior in the freedom movement. Your business model is fundamentally predicated on human freedom. People need to be free to use your products, and you want to make people more free. In other words, there's both a revenue generating and kind of an iterative approach to freedom and how it helps your business and how you believe that your business can help the world. And I've heard you talk about this, and you and I have talked about this as well. What do you believe, given the places that you've visited, from North Korea to other places around the world, what do you believe is the biggest threat to freedom in the world today?
Well, most governments are actually opposed to free speech and free information, especially about their own performance. And I didn't take those courses in college because I was busy doing other things. I didn't understand that this is well understood, right? That basically the US model is unique in the way we were formed as a country, the fact that we're both a polyglot, from different backgrounds, different races, and so forth and so on. That most countries are much more oligopolistic, whatever the word is, even if they're democratic. And they'll do everything they can to prevent real transparency. So Google has taken a position that the internet solves most problems, right? Because if you give people the internet, then they can empower themselves through transparency and other mechanisms to put political pressure on the system. So we've taken the position of just wire up the world and interesting things will happen. We're not suggesting it's all good. There's obviously bad things as well. But the overwhelming benefit of getting the world connected and being able to hear and communicate, and give you the numbers, we're somewhere more than 2 billion smartphone users in the world today, somewhere, and roughly close to 3 billion internet users. There are roughly 3.5 billion mobile phones being used, some of which are not smartphones. So we're only halfway to the goal of everyone. And the numbers are staggering. Now, people believe, and I believe, that we will get to within 6 billion, 6.5 billion within the next 5 years of people connected to the internet. And these are a whole new category of people who are relatively poor, often in governments which are very corrupt. Their local experiences are horrific, right? They can't trust the police, they have very low incomes, and so forth and so on. And they're going to have a voice. I'm very proud of that. So every initiative that a government has that prevents that voice, prevents that knowledge, and so forth, is something we try to fight.
Interconnectedness, communication, information, these are the forces for freedom inherently, notwithstanding the fact that there are bad things, terrible things, money laundering, pornography, that come along with these things. We can still see them as fundamental forces for freedom.
What's interesting is that when the original team that built the internet because it was all people who we were all friends, it didn't occur to us that there would be any evil people on the internet. So I, for example, when I was a graduate student, wrote an email system that did not have any encryption, any passwords, and you could just switch your identity to someone else. Didn't even occur to me that these would, it's laughable today, right? But we were so naive. And indeed, all of the security practices that are now present in the internet were added much later once the internet became a commercial and global force. But we came out of this optimism of, sort of the American university system, all sort of pleasant optimists, which I think is part of why the internet has been so successful. But in any case, the important thing is that people always are concerned about this question of evil behavior on the internet. By the way, evil people use the phone too. They use cars. They drive on the streets. There's no sort of test for evilness before you use the phone. I'm sure people have proposed this during the discussion about telephony. But so one way to fight evil on telephones is to simply listen to every phone call, which is precisely what a police state does and precisely what we should not do.
My guess is that one of our members of our audience is going to ask you about privacy in the United States, and I'm going to leave that to the audience because it's a question that I strongly suspect that we're going to get. I want to ask you something about information that's a little bit more existential, I think, which is in your original mission statement, you talked about the importance of liberty and information and human freedom. Your original mission statement was to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, and that's huge. That's an ambitious goal. When is there too much information. We talk about in Europe, people are talking about the right to be forgotten. There are days when I'd like to be forgotten.
Everyone would like nothing but good press, Arthur. And since everyone is a public figure now on Instagram, and you can only like people,
that's right. No,
we've solved that problem.
Do we leave enough? I understand that more information for the cause of human freedom is great, but do we leave enough room for privacy and enough room for anonymity? And do you see it moving in the right direction in the future?
I'm very worried about this. In the New Digital Age, we wrote that you need to fight for your privacy or you'll lose it. And the reason we wrote that is it's very easy to give up your privacy without realizing it. And I'll give you, I'm a pilot. It turns out that in 2019, there's a federal standard that requires you to carry an ADS-B transponder, which says your precise GPS location and your precise tail number, and it's not maskable. So you sit there and you say, well, I don't really care. Well, there's hundreds of thousands of people who fly small airplanes that you'll now be able to track, and indeed there's a whole industry of tracking devices to know this. Now, how would you feel if the same law were passed by the federal government about your car? Okay? There are people for whom their airplane is their car. That's a small group, but that's an example of something right in front of you, right here in America. And society, we say in our book, and I'll say it to you all, that each society will draw this differently. In Britain, there seems to be no societal pushback to more surveillance. Britain has something like 3 million video cameras. When you're walking down a street in Britain, in any of the major cities, you are on camera. They use face recognition techniques. Furthermore, that if there is a lawsuit in a commercial trial, they can actually subpoena these tapes in order to use them as part of a prosecution for or against you, right? In Britain, perfectly reasonable and clearly a democracy. In Germany, people go crazy over that for the obvious reasons. And America is somewhere in between.
Do you see that ethos in the United States changing in favor of either greater animosity or greater sympathy for complete information all the time?
I think we're of two minds, because if you look at the press coverage about privacy, people are very, very concerned about individual privacy. Everyone here in the room is very concerned about your own individual privacy. And yet our laws, for example, let's look at our laws around paparazzi, the life of a global public figure in LA, right? And the paparazzi stalking them. And yet we delight in the stalking of that person. We have to resolve these two things, right? And part of the problem with and I obviously don't like that image, and I don't like seeing it being done to people. We have to decide where we are on that spectrum, because of the digital technology world, everyone has the capability of both being a paparazzi, but also being followed, tracked, and what have you. And we have to find out where we are as a country on that.
How do we find that out?
Well, in America, what will happen is that there will be tragedies, right? An example is that 20 years ago, a woman was stalked, and by virtue of her driver's license, which was public information at that time, she was actually murdered. They passed a law in California which made it illegal to disclose your driver's license address, a perfectly good law, right? Now you sit there and you say, well, what are the rights involved? Well, it's a balance of rights. And I would argue that on balance, the average person doesn't need to know this.
Your home address.
Well, and again, today, this woman who was a television star would undoubtedly have had her address published in some other forum, and this evil stalker would probably be able to find her. So my point is that there are costs to this private-public transparency. We have to find them, and we'll find them. Our laws will be set largely because of these kinds of things. The NSA spying issues were controversial within the U.S. The people who were against the NSA spying, which include myself, would have had a stronger case if the government had done something like J. Edgar Hoover did, right?
Right.
So if you go back, imagine J. Edgar Hoover and what the FBI did with the telephone database under Section 215, right? They could have done an awful lot of things. Now, thank goodness that stuff's illegal. They're not doing it anymore and all that so forth. So sometimes these things are driven by a smoking gun.
I want to talk about higher ed for a second, because I know you care about it, and you've made a little bit of news on it lately. Everybody knows that Bill Gates, who was one of our disruptors a few months ago here, he dropped out of college. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. Peter Thiel is paying people to not go to college. I dropped out of college, but dropped back in when I was 30.
You sort of misspent youth, and you sort of got it back together.
I got it back together, certainly. The question is whether or not I should have stayed in. And that leads me to my question. You have a lot of big personalities in Silicon Valley who say traditional education is passé. And I know you disagree. At South by Southwest, you said.
And I think it's even harmful to make these claims because I think they're not supported by evidence. So let's start with the data. Most people are not you, Bill Gates, Peter Thiel, and so forth. They don't have the...
I like that grouping, by the way. Tweet that.
Most people, which includes me, are sort of clueless at the age of 18. They don't have a clear model of what they want. They don't necessarily know exactly who they're going to be as an adults. And furthermore, it's much better to keep people who are 18 in college till 22. We've been doing it for 500 years. Better to have them in college rather than at large, right? Separate discussion. So given that as a statement, if you look at economic returns of education for the last, again, 20 years, there's been a growing gap between college education jobs and non-college education jobs. There are 3 or 4 cherry-picked, brilliant, and unique examples, all of which you have given. Right? But the vast majority of people do very well by going to college. There is some evidence that certain colleges, the price value is not good enough. In other words, there are certain colleges where if you pay tuition and you look at the ROI of it, the kind of jobs they can get don't really justify the cost. But I would argue that on a normative basis for society, having those people in college, growing up, learning all the things that one does in college. College, remember, is much more than just learning. It's learning how to live with your peers, and so forth and so on. It's incredibly important. My grandfather, who was also an economist, said that when he was young, it was rare for people to finish college. My father said that when he was young, it was rare for people to finish masters. And he said, therefore, you should get a PhD because it'll be rare, right? And that was sort of my programming, and I think it's roughly right.
I've got one more question that I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to go to the audience. So get your questions ready, and then Jim Glassman is going to come and lead the audience discussion. And this is a political question. It's not who's right and wrong in Washington. It's why people vote like they do in Northern California. So I spent a lot of time in Northern California. We have a lot of supporters out there, and there are a lot of libertarians. And a lot of us at AEI are pretty libertarian-leaning too, and some of us, like me, are political independents. But it's perplexing when I talk to people in Northern California who are libertarian-leaning, who think that punitive taxation, overregulation are not just bad for the economy, they're bad for the human spirit. Why do so few people vote Republican?
Well, the dominant culture of the tech industry, at least in my observation, there's an old phrase which is government out of the boardroom, government out of the bedroom. And so if you want to sort of understand a phrase, these are people who are liberal in the sense of they want freedom, right, to do what adults want to do with each other, and they also want freedom.
What's that?
From regulation. From regulation. And they're also very liberal with respect to prejudice, right? They welcome all forms of people, sexual preference, races, so forth and so on. So when those kinds of people look at the traditional parties, right, they sort of have to choose which of the worst evil to fight against. And I think in most cases, if you look at sort of age bias, younger people tend to be more liberal, older people tend to be more conservative, right? It's a younger industry, point one. Point two is that many of them have grown up in very, very humanly liberal, that is humanist cultures where they find the apparent prejudice as they perceive it on the Republican side is a problem. It's history and bias and so forth. And my guess is that's what it is. It has to do with telling people no.
What's your advice to the Republican Party, therefore, to rectify that?
Well, the original Republican Party the history here, which again I now know and didn't know when I was younger, is that the parties swapped these positions about 50 years ago. In the 60s, the Democrats were the warriors and the Republicans were the, shall we say, more libertarian. And for various complicated political reasons, they all sort of swapped positions. And so I would suggest a little bit of unswapping, right, positions, and instead trying to recognize what are the core values. If I were a Republican, and I'm obviously a Democratic supporter, I would focus on the core messages of republicanism, which have to do with individual reliance, individual responsibility, and entrepreneurship. Those are great, great values for everybody.
Now it's to the audience, and Jim Glassman's going to run the discussion.
Thanks, Arthur. Before we go to the audience, I'm going to ask a question. Actually, it kind of follows from your discussion just now. Issues of internet regulation have become the talk of Washington, certainly the talk of a lot of people in this room. So what are your views, Eric, on the level of regulation that's right for the internet?
Well, I think as a general rule, less regulation is better. And so the problem with where we are now is trying to figure out what the harms are. And we have benefited from essentially government staying out of the internet. And I'm worried that we're now on a path to starting to regulate an awful lot of things on the internet. And what happens is you have an actual victim, right? A victim of fraud or a victim of bullying, or these are real victims and they're real cases. And that well-intentioned regulation, however, does have secondary effects. And I don't know how to say it any other way, but we've benefited because the technical people were able to sort of figure out solutions to problems. A classic example is spam, right? There were calls 10 years ago to regulate spam because it was highly offensive. And then AI techniques were invented, which largely have made the spam issue not so much a problem, right? We have different problems online. So I worry that we're entering into a phase where, as the internet touches everything and it's crucial and so forth, everybody wants to regulate it.
So we don't have any dogma here at AEI, but many of us think that, let's call it smart and targeted regulation through legislation may be the answer to the current controversy, let's call it. Would you agree with that?
I'm generally in favor of less regulation no matter what on the internet side, and here's why. It's so difficult to predict how quickly this thing moves, and many of the problems that people have can be simply solved by technology that people are inventing. I would further add that I have a strong opinion that the best way to have net neutrality and other things is competition. So what you want to do as a matter of public policy is you want to look at structures or industrial structures that prevent competition. I'll give you a classic example is pole attachment. There are all sorts of reasons why it's difficult for a competitor to add more wires to a telephone pole. So the effect is that it perpetuates a monopoly of communications from one of the players. And sometimes they're municipal, sometimes it's a telco, sometimes it's a cable company. Those are examples of regulations that we should not allow because they don't allow competition. So one way to phrase this is that you want to sort of think through, does the regulation promote competition in an absolute way? And if so, will then competition solve this problem? Now, there are cases where competition by itself won't solve a problem. We can have a long debate about the externalities of climate change, as an example. Right? It's a separate discussion, not to get into that one. But you get the idea.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to turn to our leader, Jeff Eisenach, to start with.
Yes, hi, Jeff.
Eric, welcome. Jeff Eisenach with AEI. So I want to pick up on this discussion of the role of government and go in the other direction. We've talked about cybersecurity here today. We've talked about individual liberties and human freedoms, particularly abroad. Now, those are roles where the state does have, areas where the state does have a role. And it's something we're looking at very closely here at AEI. What is the role of the American government in promoting both cybersecurity, both from a national security perspective and from a commercial perspective, on the global internet? And also separately, what is the role of the American government in terms of promoting individual liberties and freedom of expression in the global internet environment?
Well, first, I would argue that the American-designed internet and American companies are one of the greatest exports for freedom America can do. Because American companies, when they operate in other countries, operate by American values, which includes inclusiveness and proper treatment of women and all those kinds of things. And the internet itself is the strongest argument in favor of free speech, and it bedevils all these countries, which is why they're busy trying to regulate it, block it, censor it, and so forth. China, Russia, you name it. Turkey. I mean, I can go on and on.
Yes, back there.
He's got one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So the answer to your question has to do with, if you look at Section 215, as part of the testimony to one of the judges, the government said that they would keep metadata records of 300 million Americans in order to identify 50 potential terrorist targets and identify one who turned out not to be a terrorist. Okay? Now, if you think that that was okay, then I disagree with you. Okay? But that's the way to frame the discussion. So if your view of federal power in terms of these things is that it should be possible to monitor people at that level for that outcome, which is not my view, right, then we have a debate. But most people in America would say that that's probably too much, right, that there's a line somewhere. And we're trying to find that line. In our book, Jared and I, and Jim was kind enough to mention Jared as well, say that each country will find a balance on this, and they'll be different per country. And where it gets into trouble is when something is occurring in one country as another. So an example in Europe is that they'll be chasing some bad person, and they have to follow a process called MLAT to get the information out of Google or the other, not just Google, but the other tech companies. And I have some sympathy with that because they're trying to chase a bad guy, and they could use this information. They're legal, they're proper, and so forth and so on. But I also don't want them to be busy spying on Google. The Snowden revelations included the documentation that the GCHQ, which is the sort of British version of the NSA, was busy watching what was going on between Google servers, right? And they celebrated all the things that they found, which is clearly not appropriate. So we just encrypted them all, right? So what we say is, we want you to come in through the front door. We put in encryption to make sure you don't come in through the back door. And that's how we answer that question.
Hi, Andrea Shalal with Reuters. I cover the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex, and there's a huge amount of hand-wringing now going on about the, problems there are in terms of technological superiority getting lost. The folks in the building are very eager to work with your company and others, but there are barriers. Can you walk us through what will it take for the high, fast pace of technological development that you're accomplishing to be transferred to the U.S. military, which is, in danger of losing that edge?
What's interesting is I think the military is one of the most effectively run parts of our government. So if you'd pick some of the other departments, my answer would be even worse. But if you remember 15 years ago, they moved to the COTS strategy of commercial off the shelf because the military procurement process produced these sort of specialized, the $5,000 toilet and all those kinds of things that old timers remember. So there's a lot of evidence that with small amount of changes, much of the commercial innovation that is done in Silicon Valley will work very well in the military. So that's statement number one. Statement number two is that the procurement of software of the federal government, including the military, is horrendous. And it produces situations where you have contractor upon contractor with no ownership. The Silicon Valley model is very easy to understand. You have a team, they work like heck, they spend 7 days a week, so forth. It's typically a team leader, and they just move. It's impossible in the procurement structure to do that. And they iterate every week and so forth. So when I was a young executive, we had a rule that you could tell me price, you could tell me schedule, or you could tell me quality, but you couldn't get all three, right? And I think that's the nature of software even today. And that's why when the government says, well, I want a system running by November 1st, they get a system running by November 1st that doesn't work at all. Well, I would start with the procurement rules, and I think I would recognize that there is a new model for building these things. I'm a White House advisor, and I've told the various folks at OMB this, and they're stuck because the laws around procurement exist because of all of the excesses in the past, right? So they can't figure out a way to plot this new model into the current procurement process.
Claude.
He's our trade guy. Claude Barfield, AEI. I'd like to push you a little further on the security privacy front. And the specific thing that you're facing now with Google and Apple having encrypted phones and the FBI director having called you out on that. Where do you think that's going to end? How is it going to be, how will it play out? And the other thing is, you mentioned that this is not just a U.S. issue. You're a worldwide company, so you may face the same kind of issues in Europe, or the Chinese have already raised the question. Could you talk a little bit about this particular?
So we're very worried about a trade war erupting over these kinds of standards, right? Where the trade war
with the U.S. government.
I understand, but talk about non-U.S. for a sec. You can imagine a scenario where the trade war erupts because the sort of compromises that are ultimately erected in the U.S. are not acceptable to the other countries, and then they start favoring their own industries and so forth and so on. That's not a good thing. And obviously the benefit of having a single global internet is so high, I don't want to break it. We worry a lot about balkanization. We can't say balkanization anymore because of the Balkans, but you get the idea. So in the U.S., I've heard these arguments a long time. I heard them with the Clipper chip in 1993. And I'm sympathetic to the argument of we need to be able to see what's going on. I am, however, not sympathetic that people don't want to do it with a court order. And I'm also not sympathetic that we can just do it. We don't know how to build a trap door in these systems, which is only available to the good guys. Right? That if we put a trap door in our systems, first we'd have to disclose it because people would find out anyway. And second, some evil person, in addition to the good guys, would figure out a way to get in it. And I think the whole trust of this model is really, really broken. So we've taken a very tough line in the industry over this issue. And I think we will win this one, because, at least in America, because the encryption technology is broadly understood. The current encryption that we're using is largely unbreakable. Indeed, it's interesting that this week, one of the government standards that came out promoted encryption on government websites because it's the new industry standard. So there.
So you're willing to, I mean, Comey raised the question of what do, you the company, not you personally, of if he's in a situation where you've had a sexual predator and this is the only way to find him, or a terrorist.
Well,
it's the only way.
let's
You
use.
don't agree with that?
No, let's use that, because this is the specific, and it's the emotional. It's this emotional argument. So the first question is, how many FISA court orders does Google get every year, right? And it was illegal for us to disclose that. And the answer is on the order of 10,000, those kinds of numbers. They're on our website, and we update that periodically. So the number of FISA court requests that we get is manageable, and appears to me, without having the clearance to see what they're doing, it seems roughly right? And we comply with that. So my answer to the government and the U.S. government is, it's called the front door. Go to a court. By the way, you can get these things in an hour. You can get them in an hour. It's not like we're not, we have to follow the law. The law requires us to react immediately. We do so. We've never had a problem. So I just don't agree. It's fine, but I would much prefer them to say, what we would like to be able to do is to watch what everyone's doing in order to figure out who the bad guys are, right? Because that's what they want, and that's also not something that I want. And I want that to be in the open, and I want that conversation to occur, and then our country can decide.
Question over that gentleman back there, because I've been favoring this side.
Josh Cobb with watchdog.org. You talked a little bit about privacy, and you also talked about how technology can improve people's lives. At the same time, Google's been accused of crony capitalism by some people, your connection to the Obama administration, as well as your dealings with the FTC. How do you answer those charges, and would you favor more transparency in the government, and particularly the most transparent administration of all time, dealing with greater transparency with the companies it deals with?
Well, I'm always in favor of more transparency with respect to governments, not necessarily with individuals, but certainly with governments. And I guess I disagree with the premise of that part of your question. There's no question I've been a supporter of the president. There are many employees who've donated to the campaigns. But I think if you look at the benefits that Google has gotten, they've not been particularly different. And we have a long list of things which the other side would have done much better on. So it doesn't feel that way to us.
Okay, one last question, Avik.
Thank you. Ovik Roy from Forbes. You had mentioned earlier in the hour that each generation is smarter than the one that came before, and you even implied that meant that each generation might be wiser, perhaps even morally better than the one that came before. What's
I didn't use the word moral.
You did. You definitely did not.
Yeah.
But 100 years ago, you talked about dentistry. 100 years ago, that view of the progress of human nature was widely held, and then World War I happened, and then World War II happened, and then there came a point in the 50s where people really scoffed at the idea that there was progress in human nature. So I'm curious to know, do you feel that the internet or technological progress will or is solving the problem of evil, the problem of war?
There's a very good book on this by Steven Pinker called Better Angels of Our Nature. And in 700 pages, which are well worth reading, he actually goes through the calculation using death as his metric. And it's a tough book to read, by the way. But he is very conclusive in his analysis, and I agree with it, that by any measure, we as humans are better off now than we have been in the past. And he goes into this question of World War I, World War II, and so forth. He's got all the numbers. So if you define happiness not by a meaning answer, but by simply having a life and not being prematurely killed in labor, or premature, in birth, or in murder, or
Armed conflict.
Armed conflict, all that, by any measure, the world is better off. And I think there's a lot of evidence that since the Enlightenment, society has moved forward. Look at the treatment of other races. Look at the treatment of women today, what is acceptable versus what was acceptable 50 years ago, 100 years ago. There's every reason to believe that those trends will continue, especially in the developing world. You know, we're having a U.S.-centric conversation here because we're in D.C. anyway. But the fact of the matter is the real story is what's happening to the 2 billion people who are going from abject poverty to in the lower middle class. So I would strongly argue that globalization and access to information and the internet are improving the, shall we say, the moral qualities, the sort of thinking qualities, the knowledge qualities, the sort of meaning qualities of life in a scale that's impossible to see because we can't see all those people coming up the ladder as fast as they are. The internet is not, the internet is simply another communications mechanism for the goodness of people. I'm one of these people, and I'll say very clearly, the profound optimism and goodness of people is what gets us to go forward. We spend all of our time worrying about these problems, right? But go back 100 years ago, 50 years ago to think about 1942, right? An 18-year-old boy is going off to war. What does his father and mother think about that here in Washington, right? The world is a much better place.
That is a great note to end this because we're talking, we're inside an institution that's based on the idea of earned success and human freedom. This isn't fundamentally an optimistic notion. We believe that the society can advance, progress can occur, but progress comes on the basis of enlightenment, of knowledge, of empowerment, and understanding that the basis of true entrepreneurship is the idea that each and every person should be free to build his or her life. I think these are the values that we share with Eric and what he's been doing at Google. And I thank all of you for coming today. And please join me in thanking Eric Schmidt.
Thank you all. And thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Jim.
And if you don't mind, could I just ask people to stay seated because Eric has to get out very quickly. Thank you. Oh, you don't? Okay.